Hello, nursing students. This is the lecture for the abdomen, which is chapter 21 in your textbook. So remember that when we talk about the location of your abdomen, it extends from the diaphragm to the brim of the pelvis. So everything above the diaphragm is considered part of the respiratory system. It's part of that thoracic cavity. Abdominal cavity area starts at the diaphragm instead of ends at it as it does in the respiratory, and it goes to the top of the pelvis. Now, sometimes we talk about the abdominal pelvic regions or abdominal pelvic cavity, but in reality the abdominal and the pelvic region are two separate locations, but sometimes you'll hear them referred to as abdominal pelvic. The abdomen is located, bordered in the back by the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is on the dorsal side of the abdomen. And then it's bordered at the sides and the front by the lower rib cage and by the abdominal muscles. If you look at page 537 in your book, it has a good picture showing you the different areas of the abdomen, but it has a really great picture of the muscles themselves. And then when you turn to page 538, then you'll see on the top of the next page, you'll see all the organs that are included in this. So the abdominal wall itself, going back to page 537, is made up of 4 layers of large flat muscles, and they form that ventral abdominal wall. Remember, the ventral, when we're talking ventral and dorsal, we're talking about ventral being the front part of the body and the dorsal being the back area. So in the front then we have the rectus abdominis muscles. You can often feel this when you're palpating the abdomen. I got a picture here, but this is also the same picture that's on page 537 in your book. But right below you will see the rectus abdominis runs really close to that midline of the body. So if you were to draw that line going down the sternum, you would run into, if you go off to the right, you would run into those rectus abdominis muscles. Remember that these muscles protect and hold the organs in place, and they help with the flexion of the vertebral column. So when you're bending over, these muscles are what we're using to control that movement, to be able to move that area. We also have muscles in our back, as we know, but the abdominal muscles are the ones that really help us with that flexion. When we talk about the internal anatomy, we're talking about the organs in the abdominal cavity. So we're talking about the viscera. We've talked about this before, and viscera is another term for the word organ. So all internal organs in the abdominal cavity are visceral organs. We talked about the visceral layer, which covers the organs, and then we had the parietal layer, which lined the organs or lined the cavities. So viscera means organ. We have solid viscera and we have hollow viscera. So we have those organs which are solid, and some of these would be your liver, pancreas, spleen, kidneys, adrenal glands, ovaries, and uterus. Now again, we're getting down into that pelvic cavity when we're talking about the ovaries and uterus. However, the ovaries and the uterus still lie partially within that abdominal cavity, so we have to count them. So they're solid, and that means that they always have the same shape. The shape that we would expect a liver to look like is the shape that it will always have. it is filled either with muscular layers or it's filled with tissue layers. So it doesn't ever lose its shape. Now a hollow viscera is the opposite, whereas it doesn't have any contents in it on a regular basis. So these are things like your stomach, your gallbladder, your intestines, the colon, and the bladder. So these organs will take the shape of whatever's inside of them. So your stomach is a hollow organ until you put food in it, and then it'll take the shape of however much food you have in it. Think about stool forming in the small intestine. Or in the colon itself, the stool forms, and you have, it'll take the shape of that stool. The bladder, we can think about filling up with urine, so it's a hollow cavity, and maybe it's not distended or very big until it fills up with urine. So that's why we call it a hollow viscera. We usually can't palpate these organs or feel these organs specifically unless they are filled. So until they become distended, we're not able to really palpate them. Also, when we talk about percussing, you will be learning that in lab this week on how to percuss on these abdomens. You're still doing the same flick of the wrist like we did with the chest wall and the thoracic cavity. However, now we're going over different areas in the abdomen, and when we do that tapping and we percuss over those areas, we're going to expect to hear, if it's hollow, it's going to sound like a hollow sound. If it's solid, it's going to be a dull sound. So if I'm percussing over the liver, then I would expect it to have that dull sound. And we talked about the liver even when we were talking about the thoracic cavity, because if you come too low in the thoracic cavity, you're going to start percussing over the liver, and you'll hear a distinct difference between the lungs, and then which are hollow sounding, and then that liver, which is solid. So you don't necessarily, you're not going to be able to palpate these organs unless it has contents in it. This is the picture that is also found on page 538. Shows you those different areas, shows you how it takes you to the top of that symphysis pubis, and how it starts just below that diaphragm. And you can see the characteristic shape of that liver versus if you look at the stomach kind of just below that liver, you'll see that it's quite small, but I suppose if maybe you have fluid or ascites filling up that stomach, then you can imagine that it would be distended and protrude, and you'd probably be able to palpate it. Then we also have the spleen within the cavity, which we've talked about. Spleen is part of your lymphatic system. It's made of lymphatic tissue. It's on the posterolateral wall, so it's behind the abdominal cavity, and it's lateral, so it's off to the side. So behind and off to the side. And it's under the diaphragm. It actually comes right underneath the diaphragm. Now the spleen, we don't usually we're not able to palpate it on a normal basis, but when we think about if it enlarges and it is palpable, there may be certain diseases that one thinks of. One of these diseases would be mononucleosis, or mono for short. If anybody's ever had mono or know somebody who's had mono, they tell you that you should not participate in contact sports, and that's because if the spleen is enlarged, and we know it's very vascular, it has a rich blood supply because it's making red blood cells, and it has to do with the immune system, so it's very much part of the hematologic system as well. If it were to rupture, the person could bleed to death. So that's why they caution people not to participate in sports or real forceful activities while their spleen is enlarged. If the spleen is enlarged, we call it splenomegaly. So that's spelled S-P-L-E-N-O-M-E-G-A-L-Y, splenomegaly. That's in your book as well. But other diseases besides mono. It could just be an infection that the person has. Could be some type of a cancer or lymphoma. All of those different types of diseases could cause it to be enlarged. Even a traumatic situation, maybe the person was involved in a trauma and had some damage to the spleen, that could also cause inflammation and enlargement of it. The aorta also extends down from the cardiovascular system into the abdominal cavity. We've talked about this when we talk about being able to see those pulsations in the upper part of the abdomen where the aorta travels through. It's just left of the midline and it's in the upper part of the abdomen. However, it does descend down behind that peritoneum or that peritoneal cavity. So it extends all the way down through. Right below the umbilicus, about 2 centimeters, is where it bifurcates, or in other words, it splits, and it goes into the right side and the left side. If you look at page 539 in your textbook, there's a great picture up on the top, and you can see where that aorta, it's the red vessel that you see coming down. You can see how it bifurcates and goes into the right and left pelvic regions. And then it becomes the iliac arteries, and then the iliac arteries, once they hit that groin, then they become the femoral arteries. So remember that pulsations may also be palpated in that inguinal region because of the connection with the femoral artery. The pancreas, you can also see this on page 539 as well. The pancreas, it's made of lobes, so it is a gland and it has different lobes, so we call it a lobular or lobular gland. It's located behind the stomach. It stretches across that posterior abdominal wall, so the back of the abdominal wall, and it extends into the left upper quadrant. Now, I'll be talking about quadrants and regions in just a little bit here in this lecture. Now, when we talk about the pancreas, we think about a certain function that this does. You should all know that the pancreas is responsible for producing insulin. So when we think about problems that could be going on with the pancreas, our thoughts tend to travel to diabetes. Now, people can have other problems with their pancreas, but typically the one that we see the majority of the time is diabetes. When we talk about the pancreas producing insulin, and we know that there are 2 types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, when we think about the pancreas, we have to relate it to type 1 diabetes. So we know that type 1 diabetics have a problem because they are not able to produce insulin. So the pancreas isn't functioning properly and is not producing this insulin. So type 1 diabetes is more often the problem, or the problem typically stems from the pancreas itself. Now, type 2 diabetics do have some problems with the pancreas as well, but they are producing insulin. It's just that it's an underproduction of insulin. It's not producing enough. So sometimes these people have to take insulin as well, or sometimes they can just control their blood sugars. Because of the decrease in the insulin, their blood sugars tend to run high for the type 2 diabetics, and so sometimes we can just give them medication to bring down those numbers. But definitely when we think of type 1 diabetic, these people have a hard time because they have to have insulin in order to survive, so they have to get the insulin injections. Insulin, the type of insulin that's needed for type 1 diabetics doesn't come in a pill form. So these people aren't able to take a pill and have it processed the way other people who take medications to control their diseases do. So that's why they have to take insulin injections, because of the way that the body absorbs it. Okay, I'm going to stop here with, actually, I'm going to just show you the next slide. Again, this is that same picture that's found on page 539. But I'm going to stop here for the first part of this lecture, and I will post this one to YouTube, and then I will be posting the second one in a short time. Thanks.